Hey everyone, it's Tom here, Alphabetallica, back with a brand new episode, a non-compilation episode of the show. And today, as I always like to, we're getting a little meta. We're a podcast discussing a podcast, perhaps the podcast, really, probably in terms of downloads. And, when you consider the reach, the audience, the length of episodes that people engage with of the man Joe Rogan, we're talking about the Joe Rogan Experience. And, I have always wanted to kind of just wax lyrical on Rogan to a certain extent, and I'm sure I'm going to pepper this whole conversation with, long discursive anecdotes because, I'm one of these guys, really, I guess, that was, born in the early 90s, kind of when I was at uni, I was listening to Rogan, and, I just have a lot of memories sort of attached to that stuff, and, I remember I used to work at the University of Liverpool when I was a student there, and they had this thing at the front of the store, this kiosk, this small little kind of stand where we sold newspapers and coffees and stuff. And before I had an actual speaker, I used to burn episodes of Joe Rogan on CD and sort of change every 70 minutes or so to get through them. And I remember some kid came by once and listened to them when I was off shift or having a break, and he was like mortified by what he was hearing. I think Brian Callum was on it or something like that. But why am I mentioning Rogan? Well, James Hetfield was actually on Rogan. I'm sure you're aware of that. He's the only member of Metallica to go on there so far, even though Ulrich has a podcast. But we're going to get all to that. So today, I've rewatched the episode. Myself and the guest have rewatched it. We're just going to talk about Rogan. We're going to recount what they spoke about. Maybe, it might be good to pause the podcast here and go back and listen to this after. I don't know. But so it's not just myself all the way from San Jose. Mark, how's it going?
Hey, it's going really well. I'm really glad to be here, and it's nice to be. I'm now a veteran of your podcast, being on here a second time.
Yeah. Judas Kiss, right?
That's correct. Judas Kiss.
What was that, like 50 odd, 60 odd? I hadn't checked that. Maybe a little later?
I think it was around 50, 57, 58, 8th episode, yeah.
And, just before we get to the day's subject, as always, you can follow us at Metallica Pod. Get in touch with me, metallicapod@gmail.com. If you want to come on the show and you want to discuss any topics, I'm always working on things like, if you support us over on the Patreon, all the episodes like this go on there first. The recent Jason Newsted history, which I know you just checked out beforehand, that's been on the channel. And, working towards other episodes, I'm going to do a review of Metallica at Glastonbury, which interestingly, Hetfield mentions towards the end of this chat that I forgot about. And I'm going to include that definitely in my altogether review and notes and the short film he spends a little bit of time on. But again, if you enjoy the show, you can review us on iTunes and subscribe. Like you can subscribe to Rogan, of course. And, Mark, I'm kind of the fanatic here. I know you're maybe a bit more of a passive Rogan fan. Is that fair to say?
That's right. I've always found him hit or miss. I know he has one of I'm clearly in the minority here because he has one of the most popular podcasts, in America. And,
I don't worship him.
I
should say I'm not like this kind of like disciple of Rogan or something. Like I get his flaws, like.
Yeah. So I do listen to quite a few podcasts, and I find the platform or the method just so much more interesting than what I grew up with. First of all, it's very cute that you're a child of the early 90s.
Right.
A young lad you are.
Yeah.
And so, what I grew up with, and when you talk about celebrities, it's the late night shows where it's a tight 6 minutes, 2 stories and a plug.
Oh, yeah.
Or you're listening on terrestrial radio and you have, 20-minute, or you have just a few minute segments, interspersed with, weather and traffic, and long breaks, every 5 minutes. And so to be on a podcast where Joe or others, can talk for 2-3 hours at a time and really dig down into someone's, a variety of interests. It can be, hit or miss, but I just find it so much more revealing and interesting to learn about these people.
Totally. And, that's a common topic actually on Rogan and on podcasts in general that like they just kind of, Bork looking back. Like I love Conan and David Letterman and stuff like that. But you're right. It is just like 6-10 minutes. It's like on this episode, for example, Hetfield goes at length on bees. He could never do a bee segment on Fallon. They would never have him on to just talk about that. He'd have to talk about Metallica, but here he doesn't really do that. And yeah, it just makes everything look so ancient, doesn't it? Like, you know, it's all cut up into YouTube clips now, and it's just kind of almost is podcastified, the kind of late night format. Like, I think it's just kind of been, you know, eaten alive. And yeah, I do like that. And you know, again, like, you know, I know Rogan especially is such a hot button topic. He's always inspiring some sort of alt-right insurrection whilst also preaching peace and all. But like, all this stuff kind of blends together. And I don't necessarily watch all the episodes because there are so many episodes, an incredible amount, like really kind of that athlete stamina mentality that he has in the gymnasium. Him and Jamie bring, you know, to the upload there. And, I mean, seeing Hetfield on Rogan, like, do you remember that? Like, you know, it was live stream. I remember it just kind of fucking happened, and I kind of couldn't believe my eyes when I saw it. I mean, I do a Metallica podcast, you know, so when I saw this combination of worlds, it was just crazy.
Yeah, it was really, you know, I actually didn't know that he was on until hearing about it much later, and I went back, you know, dug through the archives and found it, and I just, you know, listened intently all the way through, just again about the bees, about recovery, which is now in the context, you know, a couple of years later after he, you know, kind of fell back again. It's really interesting to listen to it in that context again, and to just hear him talk about life and his experiences. You know, it's so much more different than what's it, you know, tell me about the songs on the new album, or what's it like working, you know, with Greg Fiddleman? What's it like, you know, working with Lars all these years? It's just so much different that you learn about, you know, him as an individual.
Yeah, and yeah, Metallica is kind of its own press office to a certain extent. Like, they do all these videos explaining the lyrics and showing you the studio, and it's just kind of like, you know, it's otiose really to just keep doing that and plowing that furrow and showing the clip and whatever. And, you know, that is what I like about this. And, you know, seeing him on here, you know, seeing that it was like a 2-hour episode as well, because as a fan of Rogan, often when he has these big guests like Robert Downey Jr. and, you know, Jamie Foxx and Bernie Sanders, you know, to name a few, they're pretty much a tight hour. And this, you know, is almost a generous 2. Like, you know, Rogan admits at the end that they've sort of slightly gone off. And, you know, before we get into the minutiae going through it, like, fair to say on the whole, I think this is one of the definitive Hetfield interviews. It is a delight.
Yeah, for sure. And if I may go back, I did look at the Metallica timeline. And so I wanted to put into context, you know, what they were doing and what they were up to. I mean, the episode, if I'm not stepping on your toes.
No, please.
Yeah, so the episode was recorded and probably released on December 16th of 16. And so that was right after, so Hardwired was just released on November 18th.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, a couple days earlier, as I go through Metallica.com, a couple days earlier on 12/14, they're on Jimmy Kimmel. And then on the 15th, so the day before, they're at the did a benefit show for the LA Regional Food Bank. So clearly they're in town. He did the Joe Rogan show on the 16th. And then on the 17th, they came up to Oakland and did another benefit show at the Fox Theater. Now, again, he doesn't go into the All Within My Hands Foundation. He doesn't need to plug, you know, anything certain. He was just, you know, right from the beginning, I felt that he sounded, you know, relaxed and chilled out. He wasn't hurried. He didn't have an agenda. It was really refreshing from the start.
Yeah, it really was. And, you know, I have heard, you know, it's rare to see Hetfield in the podcast environment. You know, it's rare to see most of these giant, like, Hetfield's had tons of rock stars, you know, like members of Kiss, and even like bands that he loves that my generation kind of forgot. Like, he had the guitar player from like Great White and stuff, and he was like nerding out, and I'm like, I kind of know who these are, but yeah, no, that was a good one as well. He's had loads of hip hop, you know, he's had Elon Musk and everyone on there. But I had heard Hetfield before. He was on a podcast that I don't really like and haven't really listened to. I only checked out because Hetfield and Kirk was with him, actually. And I think this was before Hardwired. Maybe it was like 2015 or something like that. The Nerdist podcast. I don't know if you're familiar. Chris Hardwick. He's kind of this media personality. He does like talking and stuff like that. But the show in tone, it's interesting because the show in tone, very goofy, very improv-y, not like Rogan really. Not, you know, Rogan's a comic, but like most Rogan fans, I don't find Rogan funny in the slightest. I actually think his stand-up's kind of horrible. But I still, just kind of respect him as a broadcaster and, as a legend in that right. It was cool to see that. And it was just kind of, Hetfield clearly respects Rogan, I suppose. They got on like men, they got on well. The show opens, I think, with Hetfield saying like, "Oh, Goose," he's like Moose are massive or something like that. Like it's just kind of like you catch him mid-break. It was cool to see him on here, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you're absolutely right that they seem to get along well, and they could just be they're two, alpha dogs for sure. Just talking about their trade and their interests. And, again, I could see that Rogan had a few points that he wanted to get to.
Yes.
He wanted to talk about Napster. He wanted to talk about recovery, and a few of the things. But otherwise, they could just kind of let it go.
Loose, yeah. I mean, it begins... Not in a bad way, but kind of, formulaic, and they're speaking about, Metallica and their perseverance. And, Joe is just a real kind of puts people at ease, he's a great interviewer. And transitioning into quite a deep question that, James elaborates on, the idea of kind of being hungry and then being super successful and transitioning into that and, having stupid wealth and how can you remain super competitive. And, James is very at home exploring this topic.
Yeah, he is. It's clear. I just find it so interesting that they can still find that hunger and they can find, just sort of that additional push after all these years. He talked about still wanting to find the ultimate riff and find the ultimate lyric that connects with people. And I also found it interesting that he mentioned, someone like Aerosmith, who, when someone else starts writing your songs for you, maybe that's a sign that you've kind of lost your will to sort of push your trade forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we know how much Aerosmith means to these guys. Like, I will continually hawk Back to the Front, the coffee table companion to the Master of Puppets era. And there's an amazing photo of Steven Tyler and James Hetfield. I think it's backstage at like Donington or something like that. And and James speaks again, talking about how music has this power to transform. And he kind of speaks in grand metaphors. Like, he tells a story that I'm sure didn't happen, but I know what he's going for. He's like, yeah, I looked in the crowd, and there was this guy with his suit and tie and his briefcase. It's like, what? Surely he put a Metallica shirt on beforehand, like.
Well, it's funny because I certainly don't, myself, I don't present as someone
Sure.
who you would think listens to Metallica. I'm pretty straightforward, pretty much a dork. And so I'm kind of one of those folks, although I'm not taking off my tie as I walk into the Chase Center or Shoreline Amphitheater or somewhere before a show.
But James really isn't pulling no punches as they go through it, which I really liked. He was very candid, speaking about being in Vail.
Where do you live these days?
I live in Vail, Colorado.
Oh, no shit, man.
Yeah.
Wow, that's kind of cool.
It's very cool. It's quiet, no friggin' traffic, and especially now, super quiet. Snow does something to calm you down a little bit.
I agree with that. I remember when I was a kid in Boston, there was those days when it would just snow hard. You'd go outside and you experience quiet like you never heard it before.
Right.
It's like
awesome.
Everything gets filtered by that snow.
Mm-hmm. Well, I like, there's a lone wolf part of me that maybe you can relate to, but I like being by myself. But I also I need people to connect with as well. But when I get out, living in Vail, moving from California to Colorado was a great thing for me. I feel really, I feel a part of nature there. And you don't want to be inside there. There's something about it. You just want to be outside all the time.
Well, it's so beautiful.
Talk to me about Vail. Like, I have no experience of the place. Have you been there? And Colorado in general, like, it's a very beautiful town, right?
Yeah, it is beautiful, and it's Vail, Aspen, Telluride, all of those places are resorts. They're in Colorado or Utah, kind of in the Rocky Mountains. As they say, it's the best snow in the world.
Yeah, the Gore Range is there, I think. Yeah, from the Coors can, which James says as well.
Yeah, and it's, it is sort of that, American kind of frontier sort of that you would see like a John Wayne movie with more snow. And so that, in that part of the country, politically and sort of with the attitude of like, it's a little more in the middle, they're accepting of hunting and kind of those just kind of that frontier mentality a little bit, as James mentioned. And it's a lot different than, I can imagine than when he was living in Marin County. As a Bay Area resident, lived here all my life. So if you think of Marin County, for those who want a quick geography lesson, like if you hold out your right hand and you have the Bay Area, and San Francisco is kind of at the tip of your thumb. If you take the Golden Gate Bridge across outward off your thumb, and then you get, to the land on the other side, that's Marin County. Right. And it's extremely liberal, and it's also extremely wealthy. And I think it's kind of unusual in the sense that, both of those things are happening concurrently. And so I can certainly understand how he might be troubled with some of the politics or the attitudes about, some of the residents. I mean, I enjoy it there, and I've been there recently, and it's certainly lovely, but living there, with his background, he didn't come from money, obviously, and he grew up in Downey, California.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Which is,
I need to go to Downey. I need to make the pilgrimage there. I don't know why, but I just want to follow young James's footsteps.
As they would say, there's not a lot of there in Downey.
There must be a plaque about Hetfield, surely, like the high school or something.
Maybe, but I don't think there's anything like the Metalla Mansion or...
This is the water fountain where young James slurped. But yeah, he mentions the elitist attitude of Marin as well. And so James also says, like, almost like he always speaks in hardwired lyrics. He's like, talks about being able to start fights with himself in his own head, which is very profound.
Right. And I also get that Death Magnetic vibe a little bit, where the kind of the polarity of how he can have those arguments with himself in his head, and sort of the sort of the discord within himself.
We get into the B chat of around 15 minutes. Probably the most famous thing from this episode, I would say. Certainly in the comments, it's celebrated. And if you were just Rorschach, Rogan, Hetfield, you'd say a B. You'd probably talk about the B chat here. And it's so Rogan, as someone who, has watched the show for so long. Like, he does a lot of MMA shows, which, I'm not really a fan of, but he's a big commentator. But, often it's like, the fight talk starts 50 minutes in, and to be fair, they are waiting for the fights as well. But if he just has someone on, he'll just go down these roads. And... it's not even that Rogan's not interested in Metallica. It's the Joe Rogan Experience. They're just talking about, what they want to talk about. And Hetfield's going deep on bees, teaching, but not in a didactic way, not even in a fatherly Papa Het way. He's just talking about this thing, and you can see that it excites him as much as any old hot rod.
Yeah, that's what's really interesting in that, you might, someone who's, a metal musician, you might expect them to be interested in hot rods and cars like James is interested in. Oh, yeah. But then you get into something like now he's into bees. Now that's something that where you're just not going to get that anywhere else. And it's only, I don't even know how 20 years ago how that story would ever come out, because there isn't any method
do a
by
so
which
what cover
James
of
could
that,
tell that
like,
story. So again, with the Joe Rogan podcast and sort of this platform,
and we're bottling it up. My kids are filtering it. We're bottling it up, and it's just straight from the hive into a bottle. I mean, after you've filtered it, and it really helps with allergies. It helps with whatever, getting the pollens and the nectars from the area. So when you take that in, it helps build your immune system.
Yeah, I've heard that. So you've experienced that personally?
Absolutely. And I think being stung by bees helps you too. It helps with something getting your immune system built up to
It's supposed to be really good for arthritis. They take people, like literally take bees, people that have like serious arthritis in their hands, and they sting their hands with it on purpose.
Right.
Yeah.
I think there's some people that do it for their lips here in L.A.
We get so much info, both of him. It's 17 minutes that Hetfield has this wonderful, him and Rogan exchange. Rogan slowly gets more into the idea of being, I think it's apiarist, something like that, beekeeping, and 500 pounds of honey. James often harvests, and the kids filter it down, and get stung by bees as well. They talk about arthritis, and oh man,
it's a variety of health benefits, and the it brings up your immunity. He's where you're going to winter your bees, because clearly Vail is too cold in the winter, which I can imagine.
Yeah.
So all things. The intersection of metal and bees, that's it. That's
that is ground zero.
All the world. Yeah.
James talks about, because being sustainable plays into the very Hetfieldian idea of being able to disappear and, just to get lost in the wilderness. And he speaks about his ranch with the bees and, quad bikes and welding, and, he loves it. It's a real escape for him. And, as much as we idolize this guy in this one facet of his life as, probably the de facto metal guy out here, like, absolute beast, but he just has so many layers, and they just get peeled away before, and he's able to be very, he's able to divulge later on, many things like file sharing, etc. But I love wilderness Het. I kind of like that archetype.
Yeah, well, I can imagine too, and I know we touched on this, at a part in the interview is, when you're playing in front of people and you're around people, so often, and they all want a little piece of you, to get out into the snow, as he said, this, the weather, the snow doesn't care who you are. If you're not careful, it'll kill you. And just to be out there, not have anyone trying to shake his hand or anything like that. It must be nice to just, again, decompress and be out in nature, because clearly he loves it.
He does. And, he talks about his journey altogether, going forward, releasing new music, there being the gap between, because, life itself is expanding, seeing his kids grow up, everyone having different lives and kids, but they all can't live without Metallica, 4 married guys that know more than anyone knows about each other. And, speaks about knowing Lars, probably other than family, the person that he's known the most. And, that is a wonderful partnership. But for the most part, overall, spoiler alert, not much Metallica chat. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but surprisingly so. I'd say about 15%, 20%, something like that. Not much.
Yeah, and which is fine, because there are plenty of avenues in which you can get, your Metallica discussion, and you can talk about lyrics, and you can talk about shows, and you can talk about set lists, etc. But then, to get deeper into the individual, talking about bees, talking about going out into into Russia and hunting bears, on military copters. That's really interesting stuff that, again, you're not going to get anywhere else.
No, and Lemmy gets brought up as well, and Hetfield comparing himself to the person early on that he sees in the crowd. He's that person looking at Lemmy, and, Lemmy had died recently at the point of this being recorded. Certainly wouldn't be Metallica without Motorhead, James says. I mean, it cannot be taken for granted, can it, the influence of that band?
For sure. And Motorhead, clearly, and the new wave of British heavy metal was so influential for those guys. And, they've really sort of stuck to that metal ethos, through their entire career. A little bit of experimentation here and there to some people's chagrin, as I understand. But, it's just remained their influence for the entire time. A lot of times you'll see bands, they'll, go totally different, have different interests, maybe go country, after years and years to try something completely different. But Lemmy remains, and he was around forever. Lemmy remains, influential to this day.
Yeah, uncompromising. And, Joe does have this tendency. I've certainly seen it on the show with Theo Von, who is a comedian from Louisiana. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's pretty on the come up right now. Really funny dude, but a little bit esoteric, a little bit abstract, and Hetfield just didn't quite get it. And he does have this tendency as well of just sort of trampling on punchlines a little bit. So Hetfield tells actually a really funny story after the Motorhead thing, a quick little one about him and Lars meeting through the ads in the magazines, and how he would just always go to H to look for heavy metal at the back, and there'd only be 2 ads. So he was like, well, we should meet, and it was him and Lars. But Hetfield just sort of pushes through, like you say, something he wants to mention, something that any podcast host rightly wants to get into, because you always get good copy. Just recently, Kirk Hammett, I might have to cover that on the show as well. Kirk Hammett was on Dean Delray's podcast, Let There Be Talk, which is a podcast that I adore. Very similar format to Rogan, but more kind of stand-up rock and roll stuff. But he does do other stuff as well. And he asked about Napster, and Kirk felt that they didn't really make an impact at all, which I kind of disagree with. But Rogan brings up Napster here. Rogan's interested, right?
Yeah, and I found it kind of interesting that he went to that, because, at the time of the interview, that story was kind of 16 years old. Sure. And I felt that it's kind of been, that information has been sort of trod upon, quite a bit. It was revealing, though, what he said about it, that, other musicians were supportive of what they were doing. And, but they couldn't go public about it because of their, because of what they felt was their relationship with their fans, or what their, posture was publicly. I think we can all agree that, Metallica and Lars were on the, they're kind of on the right side of history when you look back at it.
Totally. Absolutely. Yeah. And I was one of those kids, definitely. I was very young at this time, and just kind of indiscriminately going on LimeWire and Carpe Diem Baby, like not the song, but that attitude certainly. But yeah, no, I mean, he's ultimately, the argument is you don't get to choose how to distribute our music that we own, or but that was the point, wasn't it? It just stole from everyone.
That's exactly right.
It was like snow. It was like snow in the Vale. Like it's going to affect us all.
Yeah, it was, the way he explained it is perfect. And a lot of times you don't think of musicians or artists as professionals, and you think that they put their artwork out there, or they put their songs out there, and it's just for everyone to have, whereas, you didn't pay, when I was younger, you didn't pay for terrestrial radio, and you just hear the song. So maybe, our attitude was, well, if I can, I listen to it for free on the radio, why don't I just pull it from Napster or Kazaa, which is the one I think I used.
Yep, Kazaa was
and,
out there.
You just have it for free there, but, it makes sense. And it certainly makes sense now that, you pay for everything digitally now, whether it's subscriptions or, outright purchases. So it makes sense now, but, it was difficult for, I think, the general public to kind of conceptualize, paying for something that you listen to online, or that, you've heard, in the past through the radio.
Yeah. I mean, there was a lot of adverts, kind of anti-copyright adverts that were on a lot of DVDs in the UK that Stephen Fry actually mentioned, where it's like, you wouldn't download a car, or you wouldn't download a handbag or something, which kind of didn't quite get it. But Hetfield speaks about, getting the rights to their catalogue, and, the master recordings, and, his kids not even understanding why they didn't have it, and, him wanting to celebrate, and kind of being a little bit beyond them before they understood it. And what I like is, there's this kind of weird meme, isn't it? Okay, boomer. But here I'll say, okay, boomer, positively, because, this is something guys of a certain age speak to, and I love hearing about it. Being young, and vinyl, and the ritualization, and obviously I can't really experience that, but I can certainly imagine it. And, James is just eyes agog, as if he's on the bees again, just like cleaning it and setting the needle down. And him and his high school buddies hung out recently, and they listened to a Kansas album, and I was like, yes.
That's right. And Joe did his Carry On My Wayward Son impression. And it's funny that he talks about sort of the tactile and the visual part of buying an album. Because, when I bought And Justice for All, which is the first Metallica album, I bought, part of it was actually a cassette. You open it up, and Metallica was particularly good at this. And they might have been the best of all the bands that I listened to at the time. You open up that cassette, and there's a 16-page foldout which has all of their lyrics. It has, their pictures on it. The hammer of justice crushes you with the four faces, and they're always really good at that. And so it's that full experience of listening to the music. There's all the lyrics, the pictures, and I would sit, which what people don't do now is, I would sit there in my room, listen to the music, and I would read along the lyrics, just on an afternoon after school, doing that. And so, again, that experience of, something more than just the music and the other things that surround it, is important to them. And now they have the method to do it. They were talking about owning their own vinyl press, and they can, that kind of thing, which really gives them a whole lot more control over, how they want to present themselves and their, and their art.
Yeah, I love hearing about it. James saying as well, in terms of that iconography, him picking out album covers based on just what they look like and how he discovered loads of stuff. And that's what his kids would do at Urban Outfitters, which is where they got vinyl, which again, the idea of just pop a heck of his kids and just, buy these records, whatever, and, them going in. And, it's such a romantic ideal that he's talking about here, because the way I discover music, if I like a band, I go on Spotify and I look at related artists to that band. It's such a drab way of doing it. It doesn't have any of the romance or the escapism, but, it's the same music at the end of the day. And, he just kind of just waxes lyrical a little bit on this.
Well, like releasing an album. Here's how we'd like to release it.
Right.
We don't want it leaked over here. We don't want this happening. We don't,
right.
A presentation is part of the art. Like when you walk into an art studio, the artist has been in there putting it together. Like, okay, I want you to see this first and then that. And then you go here and you get bam, that there's a passion behind that. And when someone just throws it out there and it just, it kind of loses an impact. So if I'm complaining, punch me in the face. But we have survived and we feel good about it and we've adapted, but the record company certainly did not.
No, they took a hard hit.
No.
But also, when you look at the record deals, the deals that record companies make with artists, and you see, what are record companies selling? Well, they're only selling your work. Without your work, without your creativity, without your creations, there's nothing to sell. That's all they sell.
They talk a little bit again about lip syncing and Hetfield taking his kids again to concerts and seeing a lot of people do it. I wonder who he's been to see. I'd love to hear his reviews on bands.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. And I know that he talks about, there's dancing and there's choreography in the song, and it's, they're playing tracks because,
it's like Taylor Swift or something. It must be something like that.
Yeah, when he sees the, performer, there's clearly tracks, and it's because, the explanation is because, the performer is out of breath after doing all of, I guess, his or her choreography. Yep. And it's like, don't dance, play, which is, which is something that's, anathema to, when you're metal, because, there's a certain amount of authenticity there. But I think, in other genres of music, it's, there's more of a emphasis on sort of the presentation and the look of it. Whereas, of course, Metallica dressed in all black and had a very stripped down stage for years and years and years. So, there's a different attitude about the performance.
And he makes an allusion to, but I'm sure you caught it, but he doesn't explicitly say what it is, but he talks about the Bridge School benefit concerts, the Neil Young concerts, and kind of compares the, heavily kind of saturated backing track bands that you mentioned before to being up there with just, an acoustic plugged in or whatever, a very basic drum kit, and you can hear every buzz and every scrape. And, the British School cover, obviously they're very good for Metallica, and we have covered them before on the show, check out those episodes. But they talk about Neil Young as well, and his ranch, and, that sort of, they're a little bit on makeup. But Rogan keeps pulling back to Napster, and James makes a point that stops people, certainly myself, dead in their tracks. It's just such a good point. He was just saying, if you don't pay music-wise, it'll become a hobby, and he doesn't want to see a paramedic at his house, doing it as a hobby.
That's it. That's exactly right. And I do appreciate him, talking about it in those terms because, again, as I was saying, artists are professionals and they should be paid for their work. So I totally understand that they need to make, ways to financially make it work for them. Otherwise, they are going to do something else, or they're going to, play to the lowest common denominator of pop music or anything that's going to sell. Whereas, if they have the ability to earn money for their talents, it's just like any other job. I shouldn't exactly like the paramedic, or if you have a plumber, or if you have, any other business, they should be able to, to earn it. And, cause you can't download your the plumbing guy.
Not yet. Maybe with 3D printers in the future, but right. Yeah, certainly currently they're, pretty extortionate. But yeah, he, they talk a little bit about iTunes becoming the new record company, which is, a good point. And he mentions, we have a movie that bombed, but again, he doesn't say. I'm not saying he's trying to hide something, but it's just kind of interesting that he makes these cursory references and they move on. But he mentions, Through the Never, which was just reviewed actually with Phil on the channel a few weeks ago. Go and check that out. That was a fun episode. And there's quite a deliciously ironic moment where Rogan doesn't quite realize his own hypocrisy, where they're speaking about people not willing to pay for anything. And they try and find some information online, Business Insider, and their ad blocker is causing the information to not be shown, and they're not giving the advertisers a little bit of money there. So, pretty wild. Yeah, gosh, what was the specific subject when they're talking about when the ad blocker came up? What was that again? Yeah, wasn't it some sort of making money thing, some sort of retro thing? I can't quite remember what it was actually, but I don't know if they're referring back to Napster. Yeah. Episode, but and James also makes mention of the Big Four and how a lot of them need neck surgery, and Joe goes full Joe and shows a lot of like neck stretching devices. That's right. That is something about Joe. Again, I've listened to, many of his podcasts. Again, I don't download them regularly, but I do find him very interesting in that he always has some sort of device or not a pill, but some sort of medicinal item that he has for someone that he wants to hook his guest up with, whether it's his neck stretcher or something that he's selling, through his online, merchandise store. I mean, he mentions hooking Hetfield up with a Hoyt bow, I think, as well towards the end. That's right. It's the bow. It's the neck. It's that neck device. Yep. I'm sure he's offered CBD oil and a variety of pills and medicinal items for for a variety of his guests, but he always seems to have some sort of, sort of health additive that he's interested in or really wants to talk about. Yeah, the neck stretching spinal decompression sling door thing. So imagine like a push-up thing on your door frame. It's kind of similar to that, but it's almost like your noose. It's almost suicidal, actually. You sort of put it around your neck and, allow it to do its thing. And James actually kind of makes a little snarky joke as well that Rogan doesn't really respond to, where he shows the image. James is a bit dubious, and the guy in the image, it's your typical sort of medical journal sort of demonstration, and he's got a terrible shirt on, and James is like, I don't have to wear the shirt, do I? And Rogan just sort of keeps going on with the yoga treatments, and James also quotes Tropic Thunder. Like, James has got a little bit of a cultural game at times, like. Yeah. Oh, with the Tropic Thunder. The full retard. Yeah. That I don't know. Tom, was that in the James episode? He mentioned it was. Yeah, he does mention it. Yeah. Shoot. I missed that, but it's funny because I also listened to the episode with Robert Downey Jr. and they got into it in that episode as well, which hysterical movie. Yep. And his character in it was
was terrific.
Yes, and he mentions that. He mentions rock stars being a certain level of pomposity that he can't conceive of. Like supposedly, the guys in the Stones, have personal decorators on tour that would decorate hotel rooms to look like they're home for a day. Which I want to believe that. I want to believe that's true because that's brilliant. And he mentions they play a little bit. This is old school Rogan, where they played more video clips. I say old school; it wasn't that long ago, but nowadays it's not live. This is live. I think for a few reasons, like advertisers getting brought down because of clips and stuff like that. But he talks about playing Enter Sandman with the Roots and how great of a band they are. I mean, I love the Roots, and I love that clip of Metallica doing Enter Sandman on Fallon.
Yeah, and again, that's a little more of the traditional media that they would do to promote their album, and it is fun, and it brings out a fun side of the band, and of course they're all together, and then when you get James apart, you can find that he's he has a lot of depth, and he has a lot of aspects to his personality that you wouldn't necessarily connect to the very public persona of James. If I may go back for a second about the Stones getting their decorator to do their hotel rooms. When I was an intern at for an indoor soccer team at San Jose Arena, which was when I was there, it was pretty new, and Barbra Streisand did one of the first shows at the arena, and the rumor going around the building was that she, her contract writer, had them decorate her dressing room like her home. And so they went through and they did all this decoration for what her dressing room would look like, prior to the show. So that comes through and it makes it believable. Just like the old story about Van Halen, in their contract writer, how they had to filter out the brown M&Ms.
Yes.
I think that's an old story about those. So.
Which I think they did with good intent, though. I think it was to prove that the crews were fastidious with details, or at least that's how they've tried to spin it. And, shout out to Van Halen, by the way. I recently read a book of theirs which detailed their early days on the road, written by their manager, Noel Monk. And they told a great story, actually, of Van Halen's first proper American tour, where they were first support. And I think it was Journey and Boston. And it was like the early 70s or something. And Van Halen had this incredible show, as they always did. They were blowing people out of the water. Even then, this is before the first album's even recorded. But they're doing all their songs, tried and tested from Pasadena, etc. And the manager goes in the room. He expects this big party, but everyone's quiet. And the only thing you can see is Steve Perry covered in guacamole, basically. And Eddie Van Halen has tipped a whole jar of that avocado sauce over him. And Noel Monk had to take him into the bathroom and dry him off, and he was crying. It's quite sad, actually. It's quite a surreal image of these 70s legends getting in their feelings. But talking of getting in their feelings, James is talking about getting sober here, and this is a real fantastic section and quite a painful section. He speaks about final fear being the final motivator, and he mentions his wife being the invisible kid. Was that a nod or?
It must have been. Well, the song came out a couple of years later, and
many years
and
before,
so there must have been connections with his wife being the invisible kid, and it was for him and himself as well. I'm sure he felt it because again, he talked about his family disintegrating. He's living. He had to end up living with his brother. Again, invisible kid about his he got kicked out of his house, and all of a sudden the life and all the sort of the creature comforts he had were also sort of discarded when he got kicked out, and his life was turned upside down. But his wife really really forced him to sort of get right.
Yeah. And he speaks about all the vices that manifest themselves out there. And it all goes to the core of not knowing who he was, and that's a consistent sort of thing, still discovering that. And he gives Moth into Flame a little plug as well. He talks about being caught up in the rock style. That's our new single, but he does it with class, and it's cool to see him make the ling.
How long did you have to go for?
Well, what worked for me was 7 weeks someplace, basically tearing you down to bones, ripping your life apart. Anything you thought about yourself or what it was, anything you thought you had, your family, your career, your anything, gone. Strip you down to just, okay, you're born. Here's how you were when you were born. You were okay. You're a good person. Let's get back to that again. And then they slowly rebuild you. And then I went to another, they call them aftercare places. I went there to a couple different ones, and they fine-tune stuff and get you integrated back into life. Because when you're in this cocoon and you're friggin' raw. I mean, I was raw meat when I came out, and you can see it in that Some Kind of Monster movie. I was pretty raw still. I didn't know what I could or what I should or shouldn't do, you know. So the last place we went to was a place that helps relationships. So they got me and my wife together, and we'd see people separately and then come together and talk about what we did. And communication friggin' saved my life, saved our family, and working through that stuff.
He speaks, they speak a little bit about the PTSD, transitioning from world to home. And then we get into, a final little taste of actual Metallica chat, where James is talking about the 91 Time Warner. We covered it on the show with Dave, actually. Go back and check that episode out from early days in the Alphabetallica archives. But he mentions the free concert. He actually misremembers. He forgets Black Crowes and ST and seems to think Motley Crue played. But, I mean, he's played millions of legendary shows. I'm not going to hold it against him.
Yeah, there was. I was really big into the music. That sort of hard rock, hair metal, Metallica, and also Metallica. Would not include them in hair metal at the time. And so there was another promotion of peace concert, which was it was Motley Crue, Bon Jovi, Gorky Park. Was the local connection, and Ozzy Osbourne, Skid Row. There was a big show there, and I don't know if Metallica was included there, but it was, obviously it was right around the time the Black Album is coming out, and they're an enormous band, and Russia's just opening up after the Soviet Union disintegrated.
Glasnost, yep.
And so there's there were a few shows in that era where it's just. The young people of Russia all of a sudden have this exposure to this great music, and the outpouring of sort of that was just amazing. I mean, you talked about up to 500,000 people at the airfield.
Yeah.
What a insane! I can't believe it.
Unbelievable and weird that. I think a few months later, when Trump was inaugurated, that image of the airfield went viral again. Because people were just making comparisons between Metallica then, Trump then, or whatever. So, and it is great to see James reminisce over this unbelievable occasion. They mentioned the helicopter as well, and people yelling from it because they didn't understand what moshing was. And a little bit of research me and Dave did back then. I recall the police were especially brutal as well, and some would eventually down their batons and just get in the crowd and enjoy it. But I think it was pretty authoritarian despite that. And AC/DC headlined, of course, but everyone remembers Metallica. I don't think I've even seen that AC/DC 91 performance. I love AC/DC as well, but it's not really spoken about in their annals there. So then it goes over into hunting. Both the guys love hunting, and they're both in their bag talking hunting, aren't they? They're you can both tell they're quite densely intrigued by it.
Right. They're talking about, well, I certainly learned that the bow technology is exploding with apparently new new technology and upgrades really every year. It sounds like they're advancing as quickly as cars. And who would have known the simple bow has a new twist or new something every so often. They apparently they like various differences between different brands. They certainly got deep into it. It's something that it was interesting to listen to. It was interesting to listen to, once on a podcast. I don't know if I'm going to go out and, learn more about bows, but it was interesting to listen to two guys just talk hunting on that level about going out into, they put like deer urine or whatever, on them, the certain scents. And of course, Joe talks about if you're downwind from a deer or exactly sort of the minutiae of hunting.
Yeah, and they talk about breath as well, and that giving off to predators, and how some guys chew mint leaves and to sort of cleanse their breath of the it is quite fascinating stuff. And as a long-time Rogan listener, he has probably about 20, 30 things that he loves to talk about, MMA or judo or whatever, or politics or whatever.
Yeah.
And hunting is certainly one of them. And there can be highs or nadirs. Like, I don't really like Cameron Hayes. He's this kind of ultra-conservative guy that he's had on many times, very passionate about bow hunting, but a bit of a kind of blowhard compared to Steven Ranella, who's almost this outdoor poet, who is this, he's a hunter and he has Meat Eater, I think, on the Discovery Channel or something like that. But yeah, he's awesome as well. So it was cool to see Rogan like being a little bit more of a comfortable environment. Maybe that's why he's not necessarily the biggest music head. Like, he has had a lot of artists on, as I say, and he is interested in music to a certain extent. He says that he liked Hardwired in the gym and stuff like that early on in the episode, but he's not maybe like me and you are, where we can reel off our favorite albums and eras and stuff like that. And
for sure.
And that's just we end up pretty much with the idea of the blowback for Glastonbury, which had happened a few years before. James says it's the ultimate celebration in English hippiedom. And I mean, it's cool to see Hetfield close this out, right?
Yeah. Have you seen that? I'm sure you've seen that video with all the research that you've done. Did they show it on the show?
They did actually. They did.
It's funny because you keep talking about the YouTube clip, and you know what? My experience with this pod is I've listened to it several times on through my phone only. So I don't have any visuals, but I have seen the Glastonbury, where the foxes start hunting the hunters, and so it is funny that they come back to that, and that they have the sort of the personalities and the willingness to do something like that, because not all bands would.
No, certainly not. And they would, they would take themselves a lot more seriously. Like, I think I remember when Jay-Z actually did something similar, where when he headlined in 2007, there was a lot of controversy for whatever reason, a rapper, on the quote-unquote rock festival or whatever. And Noel Gallagher had said something, and he came out of a Telecaster or a Stratocaster not plugged in, and Wonderwall playing and just absently strumming, and like it was a great way to lead into it. So Metallica was sort of taking up that charge. But that kind of concludes the interview. We have given you a whistle-stop tour here, folks. I mean,
I'm so sorry. I was going to say that certainly, with Joe, where I like what you said about Joe and James being able to connect over things that are other than music. And Joe is not he's not a Metallica fan like we are, and clearly he likes the music, but I don't think his deep dives go as far as as our deep dives. But they can certainly connect over clearly Colorado and hunting and some of those other aspects, which is good, because otherwise I'm not going to hear that, that part of the conversation. And it is nice to get, again, that different side of the personalities.
It is. It completely is. And it just kind of, maybe even Hetfield knew this. Like, Hetfield could have, obviously gone on any podcast, and he, still will probably go on some, but he's not been on Mark Maron, for example, which is a little more probing at times if Mark's in the mood for it. Whereas, Rogan is not an easy ride, because it's not an interrogation, it's an interview, but he just, he won't kind of take you to, more in-depth places if you don't want to. And again, we get very little Metallica, but we still get dad jokes from James. Joe Rogan says, do you bear hunt? And, Hetfield's like, well, now I wear clothes, like, and everyone's sort of grumpily, the comedian's been out of Foxed or whatever, but no, it is a funny little barb there. And that's it, guys. So, go back and listen to this whole episode. Obviously, you've heard the clips that we've peppered throughout this, but it's a terrific episode. It's got 3 million views just recently. It's clocked over onto that, and I'm sure it's got many, many more downloads. But I know it is one of the more popular sort of Rogan musician guys that have been on there, and he's had some fantastic guys on that roster. Like, Mark, we need to see all the other members on Rogan, right?
Oh, absolutely. I think I would love to hear, Lars. I'd love to hear Lars
on.
talk for 2 hours about a variety of things. And that Lars would go the full 3, I think, without taking a breath, because
Definitely.
He's not shy around a microphone.
No, and he does his own show. It's Electric.
Yeah.
So it's like,
It's funny.
you know.
That's originally how that's originally looking for Lars is It's Electric. That's originally how I found Metal Up Your Podcast, because I couldn't find It's Electric.
Yes.
It wasn't available on the platform. And then obviously through MUYP I found you. So it all goes back to looking at podcasts and trying to find Lars on a podcast. I'd love to hear him on Joe Rogan and the other guys as well, because what do you know about Kirk, or what do you know about Robert? And not a whole lot. I'd love to hear. I'm sure Robert has a lot to say about his influences and the other parts of his personality. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and they would be A-listers in the pantheon, really. Like, Rogan's had any old guy on, so to have those on is an obvious must. I will send you the link, and again, people, go listen to Kirk Hammett on Dean Delray's podcast, which was just released in the last couple of weeks, and they talk about everything, and that's a really good exploratory interview. I'm going to actually Google afterwards if Rob's been on anything. I am interested in that. Just before we close up, at Metallica Pod, I asked you guys, what do you think about this episode? Who are your favourite Rogan guests? I mean, I haven't even mentioned Joey Diaz yet, who is a Rogan stalwart, who has his own podcast, The Church of What's Happening Right Now, that I listen to obsessively. I love that show. Stephen Ranella, that I mentioned before, who is the American outdoorsman and historian. Dan Carlin, who does an incredible podcast series, Hardcore Histories, to do Common Sense. Let's listen to you guys. Michael Hampton says Graham Hancock, Randall Carlson, blow your mind. Deep Purple podcast says Dan Carlin's incredible. Can't get enough of his podcasts. Dr. Rhonda Patrick is my wife, Birdo says. Ralph's just saying James. Ralph, I respect that answer, but there's a lot more good Rogan guests out there. Everything I know about bees, I learned from this interview, Freyden says. And finally, Man Like Dave says, this is a podcast. Diaz, of course, Joey. Duncan Trussell is a beautiful man. Stanhope. Miss Pat is always good. Yeah, Miss Pat is so funny. The few Jim Norton appearances were wonderful. Bill Burr, though. That's a man who delivers every time. I mean, Mark, like, podcasts for yourself other than Rogan, like, what do you enjoy listening to?
Well, I've listened to the Adam Carolla podcast, who's one of the other sort of longtime stalwarts of the genre. So Adam Carolla. I listen to a variety of sports and movie podcasts, Bill Simmons, Ryan Russillo. And, really, I feel like what I did wanted to say is that I felt like the original podcast was the Howard Stern Show, and where he would have a different sort of format where he would talk for a half hour or a full hour with a guest, before going into, before needing to go into his extended, commercial breaks. And I felt that he was always underrated. I think he's getting that notoriety now, but I always felt that he was an underrated interviewer, and that he can make people feel so comfortable, and he asks questions that the publicist doesn't want to be answered, but that, after doing hundreds of interviews, a guest is going to want to talk about, what it's like backstage at a show, or what it's like, in a variety of situations that, and Howard will always sort of tease that and pull that out of a guest. And he was so good at doing that. So I really think Howard was the originator sort of this, of this format. And I always liked him from the beginning. He would get into the sexual stuff and some, sort of, not gross, but like, sophomoric kind of stuff. But, he could also really get a good interview out of someone, because he has, 25 minutes, 45 minutes to talk to someone and really, get some good stuff.
I like Stern as well. Like, I've got into him fairly recently, like probably in the last 5-6 years or so. And in no way do I have a grasp on the history or anything like that. But I like Artie Lang especially. And I enjoyed his appearances on the show. And I'm a big fan of Artie as well. And just, like, it's funny you mentioned before about like late night and stuff like that, but Howard had a lot of good interviews like that, like with Conan and stuff that I've listened to. Stephen Colbert one's very good as well. I mean, I'm trying to think who else what other podcasts I want to see the Metallica guys on. It's difficult to say. Like, Rogan is kind of almost the apex, like in terms of like the archetypal podcast interview format. Like, there are loads of other guys doing it, no doubt, like Maron, like Kevin Pollak, etc. But so let us know, guys, if you can think who else you want to see James, Kirk, Rob, or Lars on. As always, follow us at MetallicaPod. Get in touch with me, metallicapod@gmail.com. Patreon, if you enjoy the show, you want to give back to the show, you can help us out there. Leave us a review on iTunes. I mean, Mark, just before we close, I know since we last spoke, you attended S&M 2, right? You went to the second show.
That's correct. I went to the second show. I was unable to get. I was part of that cluster trying to get tickets for the first show. Oh. Obviously sold out in 5 seconds. But I did get to go to the second show. It was obviously I loved it. I had a great time. What I was hell bent on ever since I heard the announcement of the show is that the glaring missing song from the original S&M was "Creeping Death," and I thought it was a slam dunk that they were going to that was going to be added to the second show, and I didn't hear it, and I was, I don't know about. I was disappointed not to hear it. I really enjoyed the show, but I was really, really hoping that I would get "Creeping Death" just because the subject matter and sort of that big sort of kind of a Armageddon type of topic of it would really lend itself to be with the symphony, and I didn't get it, so that was a very minor disappointment. But overall, terrific show. Again, one of the highlights is everyone singing along to "Memory Remains," and that when you have a crowd of people, 18,000 singing along without even as the music fades out, it's just so terrific. It's partly why I'm not obsessed, but I have this huge interest in English football fan culture. And it's that singing, and it's that singing and that togetherness.
You'll never walk alone.
Oh my goodness gracious! I hear songs of that. I hear that, and I've never experienced it myself.
They don't do that in the NFL, do they?
No, you're prompted by the video screen,
Defense,
and it tells you, that's exactly right, and you get the same 5 pump up songs,
oh my god, yeah.
You hear "Enter Sandman," near the apex of a certain game, or you hear "Welcome to the Jungle" or something like that. And there's a rotation of about 25 hard rock songs that they just, any arena for any sport, in America, and you don't get that sort of authentic chants and cheers and songs and new songs that are recreated all the time. It's just so. I find it fascinating, and I get just a little bit of that when we sing along, da 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 da. At the end of "Memory Remains," it's, or even, in Master of Puppets, where do 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 do, where everyone can do that. So I'm off on a tangent, but that's something that I really enjoy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've never considered that other countries don't sing, and it is, certain clubs are rated on their away fans and their songbook and their ability to rouse, but yeah, you never walk alone, people. If you've not seen the Cop End in Liverpool at Anfield do that, then you should definitely check that out. And then maybe check out the Rogan podcast, maybe have that on in the background, and go back and explore that episode and explore Rogan, in general. And check out that Hetfield interview as well that I mentioned before on the Nerdist. I can't remember exactly when it is, but if you Google it, you'll find it with Kirk. And again, I remember they were quite goofy, and they didn't really talk about anything. They, if anyone's seen the Hetfield interview where he gets interviewed by that little kid, which is about 2 or 3 years ago, where Hetfield talks about farting on the sofa and stuff like that. He doesn't really talk about anything. So if you want to go juvenile, then you can find those out, but definitely go to the Rogan one as well. Mark, finally, is there anything you'd like to promote yourself?
No, nothing. Nothing for myself. I do have. Sorry, I'm going back again.
Hey, so good.
One more podcast that I'd like to hear James on is Alphabetallica. How would you interview him? Like, I know you've thought about it 100 times, and is there a certain subject? Would you? I mean, where would you go? Would you expand more on? Would you ask more questions about bees?
That's the thing. I'd be the anti-Rogan. I'd ask nothing but Metallica. And if he strayed, then I don't know really. Like, it's difficult. It'd be very difficult because he's just been spoken to so many times. But if it's just carte blanche and if we can just talk about whatever, I'd probably like to talk about the riffs, actually. I don't hear him speak about the compositional mechanics that much explicitly, like how things are made and why certain notes are chosen and the way they end and repeat. So I would quite like to speak to that. I'd quite like to speak to his literary interests. Like, I'm like Rogan here. I'm thinking about what I like, what does he like. I can't really speak to him about monster trucks or anything like that. I don't think that'd be very compelling. But I mean, it'd be great if James did come on, but he didn't go on Metal at Your Podcast and never said why. It's like, dude, what a snub. But I appreciate it, James. And again, go check out James on Rogan. And hopefully, maybe James will be on here now. But please, Lars, go on Rogan. I think I'd love to see. I think Joe would be enraptured, as would Jamie, as would all of us watching as well. So, yeah, guys, as always, this has been a bit of a weird excursion here, but pretty worthy, I think. This has been a really fun discussion. And as always, if you enjoy the show, go back through the archives, on your podcast player or iTunes or YouTube or whatever, and check out all the old episodes. We've done hundreds of Alphabetallica episodes. We've been going for many years now. We've just explored the whole back catalogue, front to back, and done lots of these little things like when Hetfield was on Rogan. So, yeah, Patreon, iTunes, leave us a review, all that good stuff. Mark, thanks again for your time.
Oh, thanks so much. Had a great time. Thank you, Tom.